For so many years, people around the world had only one image of the little girl left behind after Anna Nicole Smith's tragic death. A small, quiet child with soft eyes who was too young to understand the chaos that surrounded her name. And even though the cameras eventually turned away, the questions never stopped following her, because the world always wondered what became of the daughter of one of the most talked about women in pop culture history. And now, after 18 long years of silence, she finally speaks. And what she begins to share isn't loud or dramatic. It's gentle, steady, and full of a truth that no one else could tell but her. And the most surprising part is how calm she sounds, even as she remembers the moments that most people would never be able to forget, like the day she first found out who her mother really was, not from family, but from television clips and magazine headlines. And the strange thing was, even though her mother was gone, it felt like she was everywhere, in old videos, in whispers, in questions people were too afraid to ask directly. And growing up in the shadow of that fame was not exciting. It was confusing, because from a young age, she knew she was different, but she didn't know why. And when she started asking questions, the answers always came with sadness, with pauses, with people looking at her as if she was too fragile to hear the truth. So she learned to stay quiet, to smile and nod, and to pretend she didn't want to know more, even though inside, the curiosity was growing louder every year. And she remembers the silence most of all. The silence at dinner tables when her name was mentioned. The silence in her heart when people asked her what her mom was like, and she didn't know what to say, because she had no memories of her own, only pieces gathered from people who claimed to know Anna Nicole. And over time, those pieces started to feel like puzzle parts that didn't quite fit, because no matter how many stories she heard, they never felt complete. And what she really wanted wasn't drama or headlines. She just wanted the truth, the kind of truth that lives in between the lines, in quiet moments, in old letters or photos that smell like another time. And the truth, she found, wasn't something anyone could give her. It was something she had to go find herself. And that search is what her story is really about. Because when she was a child, the world only saw her as a piece of the past, a reminder of someone they had loved and judged in equal measure. But what they didn't see was the little girl who had to grow up with questions no one else around her could answer fully. Like why her mother's life was so public yet so misunderstood, or why her own name came with so many expectations before she even had a chance to choose who she wanted to be. And that quiet pain followed her for years, even into her teenage life, where instead of dreaming about the future, she often found herself trying to uncover the past, looking for clues in old interviews, watching her mother smile on red carpets, wondering if any of that happiness was real, or if it was just another performance for the cameras. And what haunted her the most was knowing that the person she should have known the most, her own mother, was the person she had to learn about through strangers' voices. And that ache, that deep hole in her life, shaped the way she saw the world, not with anger or bitterness, but with a quiet kind of strength that came from surviving a story that was never meant to be hers to carry. And now that she's finally speaking, her words are not full of blame or regret. They are full of quiet power. Because for the first time, the story is coming from her, and not from the tabloids or courtroom headlines. And she wants people to understand that she is not her mother, but she also carries her mother in her smile, in her voice, in the way she loves deeply and hurts quietly. And maybe that's why she waited so long to speak, because she knew that when she finally did, She didn't want it to be a reaction or a statement. She wanted it to be a moment of truth. And now that moment has come, and in her first few words, you can already feel the weight of all the years she stayed quiet, all the thoughts she never said, all the tears she cried in private. And as she continues to tell her story, you start to realize this isn't about a celebrity's daughter. This is about a girl who grew up trying to understand a life that was written for her before she even took her first steps. And her voice, though soft, carries more emotion than any camera ever could. Because it's the voice of someone who survived the noise, the silence, the loss, and still chose to speak, not for attention but for peace. She had always known there was something different about the way people looked at her. Not with simple curiosity, but with a strange kind of recognition, as if they knew a part of her before she ever opened her mouth. And it took her years to understand that it wasn't really her. They were seeing. It was the memory of her mother, frozen in the headlines, locked in time, beautiful and tragic, and always just out of reach. For a long time, she didn't know how to respond to those looks, or the way people spoke to her like they were trying to be gentle, careful, as though they expected her to break if they said the wrong thing. And that quiet tension followed her from childhood into her teenage years, like a shadow that never left her side. And even though people rarely spoke openly about her mother anymore, the silence carried more weight than any words could, because she could feel what was being held back, what was never said. And that made her wonder, what was everyone hiding from her, and why did it feel like the truth had been locked away, just beyond her reach? As if the story of her own life was being kept in a box she wasn't allowed to open. And so she began to look more closely, to listen more carefully, picking up small pieces from side conversations, old clips online, strangers who whispered her mother's name when they thought she couldn't hear. And with every new detail, she found herself growing both closer and farther from understanding who her mother really was. Because the stories never matched, the timelines were messy, and everyone seemed to have a different version of events, but none of them felt real enough to hold on to. And that confusion became a kind of quiet ache that lived inside her, especially during moments when she wished she could ask her mother simple things: what her laugh sounded like when it wasn't on camera, what her favorite song was, what advice she would have given about growing up, about love, about heartbreak. And those questions only grew louder as she got older, especially when she started to see the ways people tried to compare her to her mother, not just in looks, but in how they expected her to act, to speak, to carry herself. And that pressure was both confusing and exhausting, because how could she live up to someone she never really got to know? Someone who was both praised and judged by the world in the same breath. Someone who had been turned into a story rather than remembered as a person. And so she made a decision, quietly and privately, that she would no longer try to live in the shadow of that legacy, but instead, she would search for her own voice, her own truth, even if that meant confronting the parts of her past that hurt the most. And that journey was not easy, because it meant asking questions that others didn't want to answer, looking into records that had been buried, reading through legal papers and old interviews, and trying to separate what was real from what had been twisted by fame. And sometimes, the truth was harder to hear than the rumors, things about her mother's pain, her struggles, her loneliness behind the glamorous image. And hearing those things made her heart heavy, but also more determined to understand the full picture, because if she was going to heal, if she was going to step into her future without being haunted by her past, she needed to know who her mother really was. Not the version sold to the public, but the woman behind the camera, the mother who had loved her in the short time they had together, And as she began to piece that woman together from all the fragments she found, something started to shift inside her, a quiet kind of strength growing where there had once been confusion. And for the first time, she stopped feeling like she had to choose between forgetting or becoming her mother. She could carry her memory with honesty, without being trapped by it. And that realization changed everything. Because now she didn't flinch when people asked about her past. She didn't freeze when someone brought up her mother's name. Instead, she spoke with calmness and a quiet kind of power, because she knew her truth now. And even though it had taken years to get there, every painful step had been worth it, because now, when she looks in the mirror, she sees herself, not just the daughter of someone famous, but a young woman who had the courage to search for answers, to face the silence, and to speak, not because the world was watching, but because her heart needed it. And in that choice to tell her story, she finally found something she had been searching for all along. Not just closure, but connection to her mother, to herself, and to the life she was now ready to live on her own terms. She often thought about what her life might have been like if things had gone differently, if her mother had lived longer, if there had been more time to create real memories instead of trying to rebuild them from photographs and stories told by others. And that thought never left her, not even as she grew older and started understanding more about the world around her and the world her mother had lived in. A world that seemed so glamorous on the outside, but hid so much sadness underneath. And growing up in that silence, she became more curious about what she had really missed, not just in moments and birthdays, but in the quiet things too. The way her mother might have tucked her into bed, or the sound of her voice in the morning. And those little things meant more to her than any of the headlines or magazine covers ever could. Because they were the pieces of life no one ever wrote about. And as she got older, she started to feel the weight of everything people assumed about her. How they thought she must be rich, spoiled, protected, or even distant. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know the many nights she stayed awake, wondering who she really was, what part of her came from her mother, and what part was just her own. And that mystery became something she carried, like a quiet secret, one that no one could see just by looking at her. And in school she learned early how to keep things private, how to smile when people brought up her mother, how to nod and quickly change the subject, because she never knew what to say. And she didn't want people to see the parts of her that still felt confused or broken. And even though she looked strong, there was a storm inside her, made of questions no one could answer. And it only grew stronger the older she got, especially during moments when she saw other girls with their mothers, laughing in cafes, shopping together, taking silly photos. And every time she saw that, something inside her pulled tight, like a string being tugged slowly. And it wasn't jealousy exactly. It was more like a quiet ache, a reminder of what she never got to have. And sometimes she would imagine what her mother might have said if she was still here, how she would have reacted to her first heartbreak, her first school dance, or the first time she felt lost and didn't know what to do. And in those moments, she missed her most, not as a celebrity, not as a public figure, but just as a mother, someone who could hold her and tell her everything was going to be okay. And that kind of missing doesn't go away. It just changes shape, becoming softer but still present. And while others moved on with their lives, she was still quietly rebuilding hers. And it was during those quiet years that she learned the most, not from interviews or old videos, but from watching herself grow up, without the one person she always wanted. And she realized that the silence in her life wasn't just something she had to live with. It was something she had to understand. And little by little, she began to see that her story wasn't just about loss. It was about becoming someone strong through it. Someone who didn't need to hide anymore. And part of that strength came from finally choosing to speak. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to be seen as more than just a daughter left behind. She wanted to be seen as herself, with her own voice, her own heart, and her own dreams. And when she began to open up, people were surprised by how thoughtful she was, how softly she spoke, how clearly she remembered the moments that shaped her, even the ones that were painful. And through all of it, there was one truth that kept shining through. She had carried the memory of her mother like a fragile light, protecting it, honoring it, but never letting it define her completely. And now she was ready to live her own life, not just as a chapter connected to someone else's story, but as the author of her own. And as she shared more, you could feel the years of silence unraveling slowly, turning into a steady voice full of emotion, full of things she had never been able to say out loud before. And in every word there was both strength and sadness, but also peace, the kind that only comes when you've made peace with your past. And the more she talked, the more it became clear that this wasn't about shocking anyone or revealing secrets. It was about healing, about finally being free from the weight of what everyone else thought her life must have been like. And telling the truth, her truth, was the only way she could move forward, not by forgetting her mother, but by finally understanding her. And in doing that, she began to understand herself. There was a moment, quiet and almost unnoticeable, that changed something deep inside her. A moment when she stood in front of an old storage box tucked away in the back of her guardian's house. A box she had walked past 100 times without paying attention. But that day something felt different, as if the air around it was heavier, whispering softly to her curiosity. And she didn't know what she was looking for exactly, only that she had to open it. And when she finally did, her hands trembling slightly, she found more than just photographs or letters. She found pieces of a life she had never seen, fragments of her mother's world before everything changed. And as she sat on the floor flipping through faded pictures, notes written in soft cursive, small keepsakes like lipstick tubes, and folded napkins with quick doodles, she felt a rush of something she couldn't name. Not quite sadness, not quite joy, but something more like connection. And for the first time in her life, it was like she could feel her mother in the room with her, not through stories told by others, but through things touched by her own hands. And every little item in that box seemed to carry a secret, a whisper from the past, asking her to listen closely. And so she did, holding each item carefully, reading between the lines of old letters, watching how her mother's handwriting changed, depending on her mood. And she began to see her not as a celebrity, not as a tragic figure, but as a woman, a real woman with dreams, worries, jokes, and love. And that realization hit her like a wave, because for so long, she had only known the version of her mother that the world remembered, the one from headlines, news clips, and documentaries. But this woman, this version in the box, was softer, messier, more human, and suddenly the questions in her heart began to shift. Not just why her mother's life ended the way it did, but who she was before the fame, before the chaos, before the spotlight took over. And as she dug deeper, she found a small journal, mostly blank, except for a few scattered entries. And even though the handwriting was rushed, and sometimes hard to read, each sentence felt like a quiet confession, like her mother had been writing not for anyone else, but for herself. and one entry stood out more than the rest. It was dated just months before her birth, and in it, her mother wrote about feeling afraid, but also hopeful, unsure of what the future would hold, but determined to give her daughter a better life. And reading those words made her eyes well up with tears, because it was the first time she had heard her mother talk about her directly, not as part of a media story, but as a real person growing inside her. And that small piece of writing meant more to her than any photo ever could, because it gave her something she had never had before, proof that she was deeply wanted, deeply loved, even in a world that didn't always treat her mother kindly. And in that moment, sitting cross-legged on the floor with the journal open on her lap, she realized something powerful, something that stayed with her long after the box was closed. Her story didn't begin with tragedy, it began with love, and that truth gave her a kind of strength she had never known. And it lit a fire inside her to learn even more, not because she was chasing fame or trying to rewrite history, but because she wanted to understand the woman who gave her life, and by doing that, understand herself better too. And the more she searched, the more connections she began to find, like a map unfolding in front of her, leading her through memories, interviews, locations, people who had once known her mother. And every piece added more depth to the story she was building. A story not just about a daughter trying to understand her mother, but about a young woman reclaiming her identity from a past she never chose but had always carried. And even though some of the things she learned were painful, about the loneliness, the betrayals, the pressure, she faced it all with quiet courage, knowing that healing didn't come from hiding the truth, but from facing it fully. And in doing so, she began to transform, no longer just the girl in the shadows of a legend, but a storyteller in her own right, someone brave enough to look at the pain and still search for beauty, for meaning. And with each passing day, the image of her mother became clearer, not perfect, but whole, and through that, she found herself standing taller, smiling more freely, and finally feeling ready to tell her own story, not to escape the past, but to honor it by living fully in the present. And nothing about that journey was easy, but it was hers, and that made it beautiful. She always wondered what it would feel like to finally speak, not just in passing conversations or short interviews, but really speak her heart, to tell the world what it was like to live in the shadow of a name so big that it filled every room she walked into before she even said a word. And that thought stayed with her as she grew, quietly watching how people looked at her, waiting for her to become someone, or to act a certain way, or maybe to fall into the same path her mother had. And all of it felt like pressure she never asked for, like a spotlight she didn't want but couldn't turn off. And for years she kept herself guarded, smiling politely, answering questions with care, never saying too much, because part of her feared that if she said the wrong thing, it would all spiral into a storm she wasn't ready to handle. But deep down, she knew there was more inside her than the world had seen. And the older she got, the more that silence began to feel heavy, like a locked door that needed to be opened, not just for the world's curiosity, but for her own peace. And when the time finally came to open up, to really tell her truth, it wasn't in front of a camera or on a stage. It was just her, sitting across from someone she trusted, and letting the words come out slowly, honestly, as if she were lifting a weight off her chest with every sentence. And what she said wasn't rehearsed or polished. It was raw, real, the kind of truth that doesn't need big words to matter. And as she spoke, the story that unfolded wasn't one of glamour or fame. It was about a little girl who grew up missing the sound of her mother's voice, who had to grow up faster than most, who learned how to be strong in ways no one ever saw, and who carried questions no child should have to carry. And she talked about the confusion of watching the world speak about her mother, as if they knew her, when all she had were second-hand memories, and the ache of everything left unsaid. And she admitted how hard it was to build her own identity, when everyone only saw her as someone else's reflection. And there was something powerful in that honesty, something almost quiet but strong, like the sound of a door opening in a house that's been locked for years. And as the conversation continued, she shared the little things, the way she sometimes wore her mother's perfume just to feel closer to her, how she watched old videos late at night when she couldn't sleep, or how she tried to find pieces of herself in the photos where she was too young to remember being there. And those details made her story feel personal, like a letter you weren't supposed to read, but couldn't look away from. And even the interviewer seemed moved, not because of the fame around her name, but because of the quiet strength she showed in every word. And as she kept talking, you could tell she wasn't just telling her story for attention. She was speaking for every part of herself that had been silent for too long. And in doing so, she gave people a chance to see the real person behind the name. Not a headline, not a legacy, but a human being who had lived through grief, confusion, and hope, and still chose to rise. And when asked why she chose to speak now, her answer was simple. She was ready, not just for the world to hear her, but for her to finally hear herself. And that moment was more powerful than anything she could have planned, because it wasn't about proving something to anyone else. It was about finding freedom. And in that freedom, she found peace and a deeper understanding that while her mother's story may have ended too soon, hers was still unfolding, and she could write it with her own voice, on her own terms, with her own heart. And in that decision to speak, to be real, to let go of fear, she didn't just honor her mother, she honored herself. There was something about the way the world looked at her now that felt different, not louder or more dramatic, but deeper, like they were finally starting to see her not as a mystery or a legacy, but as a person with her own story to tell. And that shift was quiet but powerful, because for so long she had lived in a strange kind of silence, one where her name carried weight, where whispers followed her, even in places meant to be safe, and where people judged her before she ever said a word. And now, after opening up, after finally sharing the parts of herself that had been hidden for years, she felt lighter, but also more aware, like something in her had changed forever. And though it wasn't easy to be so open, to let the world see the sadness, the loss, the confusion, it had also brought something unexpected, healing. And not just the kind that fades with time, but the kind that comes from being seen, truly seen. Not for who people think you are, but for who you really are. And as she walked through places that once felt heavy with the past, they began to feel different, not erased, but softened, like memories had become something she could live with, rather than run from. And she started noticing things in a new way. The way people smiled at her, not with curiosity, but with respect. The way she could speak freely now without second-guessing herself. The way her reflection looked less like someone trying to be brave, and more like someone who simply was. And that confidence didn't come all at once. It came in pieces, like moments where she laughed without holding back, or when she looked at old photos and smiled instead of hurting, or when she found herself dreaming about the future instead of questioning the past. And slowly those moments added up, becoming her new normal, a life that wasn't perfect, but finally felt like hers. And what surprised her most was how many people reached out, not just fans or strangers, but others who had felt trapped in silence too. People who saw her courage and felt a little braver in their own lives. And that connection, that invisible thread between stories, reminded her of something important, that we are never truly alone in our pain, and sometimes just hearing someone else's truth can help us face our own. And so she kept sharing, not as a duty, but as a choice, as a way to keep her mother's memory alive, not in sadness, but in honesty, in love, and in growth. And she began to create, to write, to speak, to build something meaningful, not out of fame, but out of purpose. And in doing so, she began to understand something she had once been afraid to believe, that she was enough, just as she was, not because of who her mother was, but because of who she was becoming. And with every step forward, she carried a quiet kind of strength, the kind born from surviving without losing the softness of your heart. And she started to imagine new dreams, ones that had nothing to do with her past, dreams that were wild and kind and full of hope. And even on the days when doubt tried to creep back in, she held on to what she had learned, that her voice mattered, that her story was still being written, and that she had the power to shape it, no matter where it began. And in the quiet moments before sleep, when the world felt still, she would sometimes whisper thank you into the darkness, not just to her mother, but to herself, for holding on, for staying strong, for daring to be seen. And those whispers became her prayer, her promise, her peace, because now she knew that even though her past was filled with shadows, her future could be full of light, and she was ready to walk into it, not as a reflection of someone else, but as herself, whole, honest, and finally free.